Hello students, today I am going to explain you the second chapter of your book Hornbill. In the previous PPT, I have already explained you the first part of this particular chapter, and today I am going to explain you the remaining part of the chapter. Before starting the explanation, I have prepared a vocabulary list for you that is going to help you out while doing the thorough reading of the chapter. Yes students, till now we have read that the narrator decides to visit the address that was given to her by her mother, where all her family's precious possessions were kept safely by Mrs. Darling. The first time when the narrator visited the address, Mrs. Darling behaved in the most absurd means silly manner. She refused to recognize the narrator and did not let her enter the house. So the narrator returns empty-handed. The narrator is reminded of her mother, Mrs. S., who had given this address to her years ago, when in spite of war they were living in Holland, and she saw Mrs. Darling, who was introduced to her as an old acquaintance of her mother. Yes students, now we will continue with the story. The narrator arrived at the station without having paid much attention to things on the way. She was walking in familiar places again for the first time since the war. She didn't want to upset herself with the sight of streets and houses full of memories from a previous time. In the train, she remembered the first time when she had seen Mrs. Darling. It was the morning after the day her mother had told her about Mrs. Darling, who was wearing a brown coat and a shapeless hat. The narrator had asked from her mother if she lived far away, as she was carrying a heavy case. Her mother told her that Mrs. Darling lived at number 46 Marconi Street. Initially, the narrator was reluctant to see the family's old belongings. And finally, one day what happened? The narrator had remembered the address, but waited a long time to go there. Initially, after the war was over, she was not interested in all their belongings lying with Mrs. Darling. She was afraid to see the things that had belonged to her dead mother. She did not want to see their belongings lying in Mrs. Darling's house in boxes and cupboards and needing to be put back in their old places again. She was scared that the things might make her very nostalgic. But gradually, her life became normal again, and one day, she became curious to know about all the possessions. The narrator decides to visit again. After her first visit did not yield any result, she decided to visit a second time. This time, a girl of about 15 opened the door, as her mother was not at home. The narrator asked about Mrs. Darling. She was told that Mrs. Darling was not at home. She followed the girl along the passage. She noticed an old-fashioned iron candle holder, that is the honeycomb, which they never used. They went into the living room. The narrator was horrified. She found herself in the midst of their old belongings, but they oppressed her as they were kept in strange surroundings and in a very tasteless manner. She was hurt to see her family's belongings lying in a tasteless way, with the ugly furniture and muggy smell. The tablecloth, the silver cutlery, and even the still life showing the apple on the tin plate belonged to her family. The narrator's keen observation of Mrs. Darling's daughter. She was keenly observing the girl, who had a broad back similar to that of Mrs. Darling. The girl was placing teacups for tea to be served. She was pouring tea from a white teapot which had a gold border on the lid, and then she took out some spoons from the box. All this crockery and cutlery belonged to the narrator's family, but perhaps the girl was not aware of this fact. She cracked a joke about eating dinner in those antique plates. The narrator also found a burn mark on the tablecloth. The narrator indirectly hinted to the girl that they missed things which are either missing from their original place or have been loaned to somebody. The narrator remembers about polishing the silver cutlery one day. One day what happened? The narrator remembers the time when her mother was alive and narrator was at home either bored or ill. Her mother asked her to polish the silver cutlery. She was surprised to hear that the cutlery they were using was made of silver, and even Mrs. Darling's daughter was surprised to hear that they were using silver cutlery for everyday eating. Finally, the narrator's final resolution. The narrator decided that she could not stay there anymore. The address was correct, but the narrator didn't want to remember it anymore. She felt that the objects were linked to a memory of a time which no longer existed. They had lost their value in the strange surroundings. She comforted herself by thinking that her present house was too small to accommodate all the old stuff. She left the house, leaving all her family's belongings behind. At the end, as you all know, the narrator went to the house of the lady who had safely kept many valuable items of her mother during the war days. The address of the lady given by her dead mother in those days helped her in searching out the house of the lady. But after finding the belongings of her mother being kept and used in an improper way, she lost all her emotional attachment to them. Everything was arranged in a tasteless way. The ugly furniture and the unpleasant smell evoked the memory of the war again and reminded her again of her dead mother. So she justified her action of not wanting to take the belongings by saying to herself that she lived in a small rented room. She had no place to keep all these things. That's why she wanted to forget that address. The theme of the chapter, the address, is a narrative that brings out the poignant, arousing sadness, that is the meaning of this word poignant, consequences of war which make one part with dear ones and with all that is associated with the lost ones. The narrator, a victim of the difficult times heaped upon by the war, gives a poignant account of her attempt to see her mother's belongings. The narrator and her mother were the ones left from the family. It was probably because of the atrocities, the cruel treatment on the Jews in the year 1941 that the narrator's father went missing. The narrator too had to live away from her mother, probably to earn a living. Life in the times of war was so uncertain for the Jews that they lived in constant fear of being arrested, looted, or sent away to concentration camps. It was this uncertainty that Mrs. Darling took advantage of and convinced Mrs. S., the narrator's mother, to part with her belongings. The narrator's comment on her mother's possessions had endured all those years because they were things, brings forth the sorrowful aspect of human life, which can be extinguished in no time in comparison to things which stay for a long time. She loses her mother to the war in Holland, but wants to connect herself to the past through her things, because memories of good old days continue to haunt her. However, she gives up that desire also and resolves to move on in life. Thank you, students. I hope you have understood the chapter. I request my dear students, thorough reading of the chapter is required to know the details and to just keep in your mind while solving the questions related to this chapter. Thank you. Have a nice day.